Right now, somewhere in Texas or Florida, there is a person training for a trip they will never come back from. Not because their rocket will explode, not because Mars will kill them the day they land, but because the 6 months it takes to get there will already have started dissolving the only body they have ever had, and there will be nothing anyone on Earth can do to stop it. Here is the part nobody tells you when they show you the pretty animations of a spaceship gliding past the stars toward a rust-colored dot. The danger is not the launch. It is not the landing. It is not even the thin, poisonous air waiting on the other end. The danger is you. Your own skeleton, your own heart, your own blood, quietly turning against you the second gravity lets go, and never fully forgiving you for leaving. I want you to actually sit with that for a second, because most people scroll past this idea the same way they scroll past everything else about space, treating it like a cool fact instead of what it actually is, which is a slow motion transformation happening in real time to real people who volunteered for it with their eyes open. And by the end of this, you are going to understand exactly why the first humans to set foot on Mars are, in every practical sense, saying goodbye to Earth forever, whether the mission planners admit it out loud or not. Let's start with the number that should stop you cold. A trip to Mars takes somewhere between 6 and 9 months, one way, depending on where Earth and Mars happen to be sitting in their orbits when you leave. That is not a flight. That is not even a long vacation. That is the length of an entire pregnancy, spent floating in a metal tube smaller than a studio apartment, breathing recycled air, drinking water that used to be someone's sweat, with nothing outside the window but black nothing and a shrinking blue marble that used to be everything you knew. Let's actually walk through what that departure looks like, because most people picture this moment completely wrong. They picture something closer to an airport, a jet bridge, a seat with a little screen in front of you. The reality is going to feel closer to being sealed inside an industrial elevator that also happens to be sitting on top of several thousand tons of liquid oxygen and methane waiting for someone to light it. If a mission like this launches aboard something in the SpaceX Starship class of vehicle, current plans describe a spacecraft capable of carrying somewhere around 100 passengers, with Elon Musk himself noting that number could theoretically climb toward 200 if people were willing to pack in considerably tighter. You would meet your fellow colonists at the launch site, and here is the detail that should genuinely sink in before anything else does. Unlike literally any other form of travel you've ever experienced in your life, there is no getting off partway through. There's no layover. There's no changing your mind at hour 3 of a 6-month trip. Whoever you happen to be sitting next to during those final pre-launch checks is going to be someone you eat breakfast with, work alongside, and share an enclosed living space with every single day, for the better part of a year, minimum, before you've even reached the surface. Liftoff itself lasts only a handful of minutes, but those minutes come with genuine, punishing G-forces pressing you back into your seat, with a force more intense than the most extreme roller coaster ever built. Which is precisely why crew selection processes place such heavy weight on baseline cardiovascular fitness before anyone is ever cleared to fly. Partway through ascent, the massive first stage booster detaches, and, in the reusable architecture these companies are betting everything on, guides itself back down to a landing pad on Earth to be refueled and flown again, while the upper stage carrying the crew continues on, switching over to engines specifically designed for the vacuum of space rather than the thicker air near the ground. And then, the moment the engines cut off, something happens that no amount of preparation ever fully braces a person for. Weightlessness. Not a metaphor, not a slight lightness, but a complete and total absence of the sensation that has anchored every single moment of your life since before you were born. You will float. Your body, for the first time in your entire existence, no longer has a clear sense of up or down, And it takes days, sometimes longer, for your inner ear and your brain to stop fighting that reality, which is part of why so many astronauts experience genuine, debilitating space sickness during the first 48 to 72 hours of any mission, regardless of how many times they've trained in simulators or parabolic flights back on Earth. Current habitat concepts describe the interior of a Mars bound vessel divided into multiple levels. Crew quarters near the bottom, typically shared between 2 or 3 people in a space that would generously be described as cozy by anyone being polite about it. A common area above that for meals, socializing, and the mandatory exercise routines every single crew member has to complete daily, because without them, the bone and muscle loss we're about to walk through in detail would happen even faster than the worst case numbers already suggest. Somewhere on board, there will almost certainly be a dedicated radiation shelter, a smaller, more heavily shielded compartment the crew can retreat into during a solar flare. Because unlike background cosmic radiation, a major solar particle event can deliver a genuinely dangerous, potentially lethal dose of radiation within a matter of hours if a crew member is caught unprotected at exactly the wrong moment. Meals will look nothing like what you're used to. Every single item has to survive months in storage without refrigeration, which the International Space Station famously doesn't even have, meaning the overwhelming majority of food aboard a Mars-bound vessel will be vacuum sealed and rehydrated at the point of eating. Salt and pepper, believe it or not, become an actual engineering problem in weightlessness because loose granules simply float away instead of settling onto your food, which is why space agencies have long since switched to liquid seasoning instead. And water, every single drop of it, is going to be recycled, filtered, and reused over and over for the entire duration of the mission, which sounds unsettling until you remember that, functionally, every glass of water any of us has ever drunk on Earth has already passed through some other living thing's body multiple times over the planet's 4.5 billion year history. It's simply a matter of doing that recycling deliberately, mechanically, and under much closer supervision. Now, with that picture of daily life in place, here's the part almost nobody talks about, and it might be the single strangest, most tangible piece of evidence for just how deeply spaceflight reshapes the human body at a level you can't see, feel, or fix with exercise. In a landmark NASA study following identical twin astronauts, one of whom spent nearly a year aboard the International Space Station, while his genetically identical brother remained on Earth as a control subject. Researchers found measurable changes in how the traveling twins' genes were being expressed by the time he returned. Telomeres, the protective caps on the ends of chromosomes that naturally shorten as we age, actually lengthened during his time in space before rapidly shortening again once he was back under Earth's gravity. His immune system showed detectable changes. Markers tied to bone formation shifted. The overwhelming majority of these genetic changes reverted back toward baseline within about 6 months of his return, which is at least somewhat reassuring, but a meaningful percentage, cited at around 7 to 10% depending on which specific marker researchers were tracking, simply never fully reverted, remaining altered permanently. Spend 6 months in orbit, and roughly 1 in 10 of the genetic changes your body underwent up there becomes, in some sense, a permanent part of who you are for the rest of your life. Now, extend that same exposure out to 2 or 3 years instead of 1, and ask yourself honestly how much of a returning Mars astronaut, at the deepest possible biological level, in the actual instructions written into their own cells, would still be entirely the same person who left. This is exactly why NASA has been quietly, seriously exploring an idea that sounds like it belongs in a piece of speculative fiction rather than an actual agency research program. Using gene editing tools, the same CRISPR technology you may have heard about in the context of treating genetic diseases here on Earth, to engineer astronauts with enhanced natural resistance to radiation damage before they ever leave the launch pad. Researchers have already successfully transferred a specific radiation resistance gene, taken from an almost impossibly hardy microscopic creature called a tardigrade, into cultured human cells in a laboratory setting, and found that those modified cells demonstrated measurably increased resistance to radiation exposure compared to unmodified ones. Tardigrades are famous, if you've never encountered them before, for being able to survive conditions that would instantly kill nearly anything else on Earth, including complete dehydration, extreme temperature swings, and even, remarkably, direct exposure to the vacuum of space itself during actual orbital experiments. Whether humanity ever actually crosses the ethical line into deliberately editing the genes of astronauts before a mission remains a genuinely unresolved, actively debated question among the researchers closest to the work. Because that radiation resistance question is not some abstract, far off concern. It is arguably the single most dangerous, least visible threat of the entire journey. Because unlike bone loss or muscle atrophy, you can't feel it happening. There's no soreness, no warning sign, no moment where your body tells you something is wrong. It just silently rewrites your DNA, one cell at a time, for the entire length of the trip. Here on Earth, you're protected by two enormous invisible shields working together every second of your life: the planet's magnetic field and its thick atmosphere, which together block out roughly 99.9% of the dangerous cosmic and solar radiation constantly bombarding our solar system. The instant you leave that protection behind, that shielding disappears, and your body becomes directly exposed to a level of radiation your cells were never built to withstand. Over the course of a Mars mission, astronauts are projected to absorb somewhere between 870 and 1200 millisieverts of radiation. To put that in a number that actually means something, that's roughly equivalent to somewhere around 600 CT scans, or something like 12,000 chest x-rays, compressed into a 2 to 3 year window. The consequences of that kind of exposure read like a list assembled by someone trying to write the worst possible outcome for a human body. Cancer risk climbs immeasurably, somewhere in the range of 5 to 10% higher than baseline. The cardiovascular system, which we're about to get to in more detail, ages by what researchers describe as effectively decades in the span of a couple of years, as radiation damages blood vessels and accelerates the kind of arterial stiffening you'd normally expect from someone in their 70s or 80s. The brain itself sustains measurable, documented cognitive damage, memory problems, slower thinking, difficulty making decisions under pressure, which is a genuinely serious deficit to develop in a person who is, by definition, going to spend years having to make life or death decisions with no possibility of quick help from Earth. Cataracts form years, sometimes decades earlier than they normally would. The immune system weakens as radiation damages bone marrow, the very factory responsible for producing the white blood cells that keep you alive when something goes wrong. And here's the cruel engineering problem nobody has solved yet. You cannot simply build a thicker spaceship wall to block it out. Thick metal shielding, the kind you'd instinctively reach for, actually makes some forms of this radiation worse, because when high-energy cosmic ray particles slam into dense metal, they can shatter into secondary radiation, essentially a shower of smaller, dangerous particles sprayed through the cabin, sometimes doing more damage than if the shielding hadn't been there at all. The current best answer scientists have is surrounding crew quarters with materials rich in hydrogen, like stored water or specially engineered plastics. But even the most optimistic version of that shielding only reduces the dose. It doesn't come close to eliminating it. So by the time that spacecraft is closing in on Mars, 6 to 9 months after leaving Earth, radiation has already been quietly doing its damage the entire way. But radiation isn't working alone. Your body was built by hundreds of millions of years of evolution to expect one specific condition every single second of every single day: gravity. Constant, unrelenting, one full G of pull tugging on your bones, your muscles, your blood, your inner ear, your everything, from the moment you were born until the moment you die. Take that away, even for a few months, and your body doesn't just get used to it, it starts to dismantle itself on purpose. Because from a biological standpoint, if you're not fighting gravity anymore, your body assumes you don't need the equipment that fights gravity anymore. It starts recycling you. Astronauts who spend 6 months on the International Space Station, orbiting a mere 400 kilometers above the surface of the Earth, close enough that a Soyuz capsule could get them home in a matter of hours if something went catastrophically wrong, still come back needing weeks, sometimes months, to relearn how to walk. Grown adults, professional athletes essentially, elite pilots and engineers in the best physical shape of their lives, sometimes have to be carried out of the capsule because their legs simply will not hold them up anymore. Their own legs, the ones they walked into the rocket on. Now stretch that same process out over 2 to 3 years instead of 6 months, because that's the real timeline for a Mars mission once you count the trip there. The mandatory wait on the surface for the planets to realign for a return window and the trip back. Multiply the damage, compound it. And then ask yourself honestly whether coming home is still a meaningful phrase for the people who make that trip. Let's talk about your bones first, because this is the part that genuinely disturbs the doctors who study it. In weightlessness, astronauts lose somewhere between 1 and 3% of their bone mass every single month. Sit with that math. After 6 months, that's already pushing 18% gone. After a year, you're staring down the barrel of something like 36%. A Mars mission keeps a crew away from Earth's gravity, in some combination of zero-G transit and reduced Martian gravity, for at least 2 years, sometimes closer to 3. Do the arithmetic on that, and you get bone loss figures that sound like they belong to a bedridden 90-year-old, except this is happening to a 35-year-old astronaut who was cleared as one of the healthiest, strongest humans on the planet before they ever left it. For comparison, a 70-year-old woman with a severe diagnosed case of osteoporosis has typically lost around 30 to 40% of her bone density. A Mars astronaut, someone selected specifically because their bones were dense and strong and their body was in peak condition, could come home from that mission with a skeleton that looks, on a scan, disturbingly similar to that of someone 40 years older with a serious degenerative disease. And it's not evenly spread across the body either. It hits hardest exactly where you need it most: your hips, your femurs, your spine, the load-bearing bones that let you stand upright, that let you walk, that let you catch yourself when you trip. The exact bones your body decides it doesn't need anymore the second it stops feeling your weight press down on them. Here's the part that should genuinely worry you if you ever wondered why astronauts get kidney stones at rates far higher than the general population. As bone tissue breaks down in weightlessness, the calcium that used to be locked safely inside your skeleton doesn't just vanish. It gets released into your bloodstream and has to go somewhere. And that somewhere is usually your kidneys, filtering out calcium at levels the human urinary system was never designed to handle for months on end. Painful kidney stones in deep space, with the nearest hospital roughly 8 months away, depending on where Mars happens to be sitting in its orbit that year, is not a hypothetical inconvenience. It is a very real, very possible way for a mission to go from historic to catastrophic in the space of a single bad night. And it isn't only bones quietly dissolving in the background. Muscles waste away at almost the same devastating rate, roughly 1 to 3% lost per month, with the legs, the back, and the core muscles taking the worst of it, which happens to be exactly the muscle group you rely on to stand up straight, to walk, to simply not collapse the moment gravity comes back into the picture. At a cellular level, something even stranger happens. The slow twitch, endurance-built muscle fibers that let your body sustain long-term activity. The fibers that let you stand in a kitchen for an hour, walk across a parking lot, climb a flight of stairs without gasping, start converting into fast twitch fibers built for short, explosive bursts of effort instead, which sounds almost like an upgrade until you realize fast twitch fibers fatigue far more quickly and are catastrophically bad at the one thing a human body actually needs to do every single day of its life on a planet with gravity: sustain itself hour after hour without giving out. Astronauts coming home after only 6 months on the ISS have described something as mundane as climbing a single flight of stairs as a genuine physical ordeal, something that leaves them breathless and shaking. Now, imagine that same body, except it hasn't spent 6 months in weightlessness. It's spent the better part of 3 years cycling between zero gravity and Martian gravity, which sits at only about 38% of what your body evolved to expect. Even with 2 hours of mandatory daily exercise, the kind ISS astronauts are required to do on resistance machines and treadmills bolted to the wall, the deterioration doesn't stop. It only slows down. Nothing on a spacecraft, and nothing currently deployed on Mars, can fully replace the simple, constant, boring miracle of just standing on solid ground under normal gravity. By the time a hypothetical returning Mars crew is strapping back into a capsule for re entry into Earth's atmosphere, their bones could be missing more than half their original density. Their muscles could be a fraction of what they were when they left. And the heart, the single most important muscle in the entire human body, has been going through its own quiet, terrifying transformation the entire time. On Earth, your heart works constantly against gravity, pumping blood not just outward through your body, but upward, against the pull of the planet to keep your brain supplied with oxygen every single second you're alive. That constant resistance is exactly what keeps your heart strong, the same way lifting weights keeps a muscle strong. Take gravity away, and the heart suddenly has an easy job. Blood doesn't need to be pushed uphill against gravity anymore, so the heart, sensing less resistance, does what any muscle does when it's underused. It shrinks. Studies on astronauts who have spent extended periods in space have documented heart mass losses of up to 20%. 20% of the single organ keeping every cell in your body alive, simply wasting away because it no longer has to fight for a living. At the same time, something almost comically strange happens to your fluids. On Earth, gravity constantly pulls blood downward, which is why your legs tend to swell a little by the end of a long day, and why astronauts describe the opposite happening in space, where blood and other fluids drift upward toward the head and chest instead of pooling in the lower body. This creates what flight surgeons have nicknamed puffy face, chicken leg syndrome, where an astronaut's face visibly rounds out and swells while their legs grow thinner, almost skeletal, over the course of the mission. Your body, sensing what it interprets as an excess of fluid up top, responds by shedding blood volume altogether, sometimes losing up to 20% of total blood volume during extended space missions. Less blood, a smaller, weaker heart, and all of it happening quietly, invisibly, while the astronaut goes about their scientific work, feeling functional, feeling fine, with no outward sign of just how compromised their cardiovascular system has become. Now picture the moment that shrunken, deconditioned heart, carrying a reduced volume of blood, suddenly has to fight full Earth gravity again after 2 or 3 years away. It has to pump uphill against a resistance it hasn't had to deal with in years, using a fraction of its former strength. Astronauts returning from 6-month ISS missions already commonly experience something called orthostatic intolerance, where simply standing up too quickly causes dizziness, a crash in blood pressure, and sometimes outright fainting, because the heart and blood vessels have forgotten how to instantly compensate for gravity pulling blood back down toward the legs. After 2 to 3 years in transit and on the Martian surface, doctors have genuinely raised the question of whether a returning heart could handle full Earth gravity at all, or whether the shock of readaptation could itself become life-threatening. So by the time all of this stacks together, here's the honest, unflinching picture of what a returning Mars astronaut actually looks like on paper. A skeleton that's lost more than half its original density, muscles a shadow of what they used to be, a heart that's shrunk by a fifth and forgotten how to fight gravity, blood vessels aged by decades, a measurably higher risk of cancer, a documented decline in memory and decision making, early cataracts, and a compromised immune system. All of that in a body that has to somehow survive slamming back into full Earth gravity after years without it. This is precisely why an increasing number of scientists, engineers, and mission planners have quietly started saying the thing nobody wanted to say out loud a decade ago. The first humans who go to Mars probably shouldn't come back. Not because Earth doesn't want them, not because the mission failed, but because the return trip itself, layered on top of everything their bodies have already survived, could be the single most dangerous part of the entire endeavor, arguably more dangerous than the 6-minute descent through the Martian atmosphere that engineers have nicknamed the 7 minutes of terror. I want you to think about that phrase for a second because it's not dramatic exaggeration, it's the literal term NASA engineers use. 7 minutes of terror. That's how long it takes a spacecraft to go from screaming through the top of the Martian atmosphere at roughly 20,000 kilometers an hour down to a dead stop on the surface. And here's the detail that should genuinely unsettle you. During those 7 minutes, mission control on Earth can do absolutely nothing to help. Because the communication delay between Earth and Mars, depending on where the two planets happen to be in their orbits, ranges anywhere from about 3 minutes at closest approach to over 20 minutes when they're on opposite sides of the sun. By the time a signal saying, "We've entered the atmosphere," even reaches Earth, the spacecraft has already either landed safely or been destroyed several minutes earlier. And there was nothing anyone back home could have done about it either way. The entire descent, every single decision, every correction, every split-second call about deploying a parachute or firing a retro rocket has to be made autonomously by onboard computers, because human reflexes and human oversight simply aren't fast enough to bridge a gap measured in tens of millions of kilometers. And Mars doesn't make this easy on you. Its atmosphere is just thick enough to generate brutal, spacecraft-melting heat during entry, but far too thin, at only about 1% the density of Earth's atmosphere, to meaningfully slow a vehicle down using parachutes alone the way you could on Earth. It's genuinely one of the worst possible combinations physics could hand you. Too much atmosphere to ignore, not nearly enough atmosphere to rely on. Every single successful Mars landing in human history has depended on a nearly perfect sequence of heat shields, supersonic parachutes, and precisely timed retro rockets firing at exactly the right altitude, executed by a computer, alone, tens of millions of kilometers from the nearest living human being who could offer help. Now here's something worth pausing on because I genuinely love to hear which side of this you land on down in the comments, and this is really the only spot in this whole video I'm going to ask, so make it count. If you knew with absolute certainty going in that a mission to Mars meant you would never set foot on Earth again, no goodbye visit home in year 15, no walking on a beach again, no ever feeling rain on your skin for the rest of your life, would you still go? Not as a hypothetical daydream where you imagine the glory of being first, but as a real, binding, irreversible decision made with your eyes fully open. Because thousands of people have already answered that question with a yes. And the story of exactly who they were and exactly what happened to the organization that tried to send them is honestly one of the strangest chapters in the entire history of space exploration. In 2012, a private organization out of the Netherlands called Mars One announced something that sounded, on its face, almost too audacious to be real. They proposed sending ordinary volunteers, not necessarily career astronauts, not necessarily people with engineering doctorates, on a permanent one-way trip to Mars, to be broadcast and funded as a kind of reality television spectacle watched by hundreds of millions of people around the world. No return vehicle, no ascent stage, no plan ever to bring anyone home. Just a permanent colony, built up gradually by successive waves of colonists who understood from the very first application form that the trip they were signing up for only went in one direction. And here's the part that genuinely surprised almost everyone watching from the outside. Over 200,000 people applied from more than 140 different countries. Teachers, engineers, students, military veterans, doctors, artists, people with no relevant technical background at all who simply wanted, more than anything else, a chance to be part of something that would outlive them. 200,000 human beings looked directly at the reality of never seeing Earth again, never hugging their families in person again, never feeling ordinary rain or ordinary wind or ordinary grass under their feet again, and decided that trade was worth making anyway. Mars One itself ultimately collapsed under the weight of its own ambition, declaring bankruptcy in 2019 after years of financial trouble and a growing, well-founded skepticism about whether the organization ever had the technical capability or the funding to actually pull off what it was promising. They never built real flight hardware. They never secured a genuine launch contract. In hindsight, it's fair to call the whole project more of a media phenomenon than an actual space program. But the number of applicants tells you something important and genuinely worth sitting with. Something that has nothing to do with whether that specific company could deliver. An enormous number of people, given the chance, would choose a one-way trip to another planet over the entire remainder of their lives on this one. That's not new in human history either, even though it can feel like something unprecedented when you first hear about it. Go back to 1620 and look at the passengers boarding the Mayflower, crossing the Atlantic toward a continent most of them had never seen, with mortality rates on that crossing, and in the brutal years that followed high enough that a meaningful percentage of the people who boarded that ship never lived to see a second winter in their new home. They knew, roughly, what they were risking. They went anyway. Look at the families who loaded up wagons for the Oregon Trail in the 1800s, embarking on a journey that regularly killed a significant fraction of the people who attempted it, leaving behind graves along thousands of miles of trail, some of them barely marked, belonging to people who never made it to the place they were trying to reach. And if you want the single most striking historical parallel, look at the actual wording of the advertisement Ernest Shackleton is said to have used to recruit crew for his 1914 Antarctic expedition. Men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return, doubtful. He received over 5,000 applications for 28 positions. Not despite the brutal honesty of that advertisement, but almost because of it. Something in a certain percentage of human beings has always responded to that exact combination of extreme risk and profound meaning by leaning in instead of backing away. And it's genuinely worth pausing here to ask yourself which category you fall into, because the answer isn't always obvious until you actually sit with the question honesty, instead of just imagining the highlight reel version of being an interplanetary pioneer. Now, let's talk about what actually happens once you get there, assuming everything up to this point has gone exactly right, because arrival is not the finish line. In a lot of ways, arrival is where the real grinding difficulty of the mission actually begins, and this is where I think the popular imagination and the technical reality diverge the most sharply. The first and most fundamental problem is fuel, and it is a genuinely brutal piece of physics that most people never think about because science fiction has trained us to assume that once you land somewhere, getting back off the ground is the easy part. It is not. The spacecraft that carries a crew down to the Martian surface is, by necessity, optimized for landing, not launching. It burns through the overwhelming majority of its fuel supply during descent alone, decelerating from thousands of kilometers an hour down to a gentle touchdown, which means by the time it's sitting on Martian soil, there simply isn't nearly enough propellant left to fight Mars's gravity, punch through even its thin atmosphere, and accelerate back up to the escape velocity needed to begin the journey home. So the honest engineering answer is that you need an entirely separate vehicle, a dedicated Mars ascent vehicle that has to be pre-positioned on the surface, fully fueled, and sitting there functional and ready, potentially for years, before the crew that will actually need it even leaves Earth. And where does that fuel come from? You cannot practically launch enough fuel from Earth's surface to fill a return rocket on Mars, because rockets are, by mass, overwhelmingly made of fuel. The Saturn V that carried astronauts to the moon, for comparison, was roughly 93% fuel by weight. And that was just for a trip to a body with only 1/6 of Earth's gravity and no atmosphere at all to fight through. Mars, with roughly 38% of Earth's gravity and an atmosphere thick enough to create drag on the way up, would require an even more punishing fuel to payload ratio for any vehicle attempting to leave its surface. The proposed solution, and it's a genuinely clever one on paper, is called in situ resource utilization, essentially manufacturing rocket fuel directly out of Martian air and Martian ice using equipment sent ahead of time. Mars's atmosphere is roughly 95% carbon dioxide, which can be captured, compressed, and combined through a chemical process discovered back in 1897 by a French chemist named Paul Sabatier, mixing that carbon dioxide with hydrogen extracted from electrolyzed water ice to produce methane and oxygen, exactly the propellant combination modern rockets like Starship are designed to burn. It sounds elegant in a diagram. In reality, it requires building and operating, entirely by remote robotic control, a functioning chemical refinery on the surface of another planet, running continuously for somewhere between a year and 2 years before the crew even departs Earth. Using either solar panels that lose the majority of their effectiveness during Mars's regular planet-swallowing dust storms, or nuclear reactors that come with their own enormous set of political, safety, and engineering challenges. If that automated fuel plant fails even once, if a pump seizes, if a reactor drops offline, if a months-long dust storm blocks the sun at exactly the wrong moment, the mission timeline doesn't just slip a little. It potentially strands the crew on the Martian surface with no way home at all, watching their life support consumables burn down while they wait for a fix that might be years away. This is precisely why the honest, unglamorous engineering conclusion so many mission architects keep arriving at independently over and over again is the same one we started with. A round-trip mission is staggeringly, almost prohibitively expensive and dangerous, largely because of the infrastructure needed to bring people home. A one-way mission, by contrast, strips out the ascent vehicle, strips out the surface fuel plant, strips out the year and a half of waiting on the Martian surface purely for a return launch window, and redirects every single kilogram of saved mass towards something that actually helps the mission survive and grow. More supplies, more redundant life support systems, more scientific equipment, more of everything that keeps a permanent colony alive and expanding instead of merely visiting and leaving. Let's put real numbers next to that, because the scale of what we're talking about tends to get lost in vague statements, like, it's expensive. The Apollo program, which only ever needed to get astronauts to a destination 3 days away with no atmosphere to punch through and constant radio contact with Earth, cost the United States roughly $25.8 billion between 1960 and 1973. Adjusted into today's money, that's somewhere in the neighborhood of $280 billion, spent to give 12 people a combined total of about 9 days actually standing on the lunar surface. A crewed Mars mission designed for a full round trip, factoring in years of life support instead of days, radiation shielding adequate for a multi-year exposure instead of a week, and all of the ascent and refueling infrastructure we just walked through would dwarf that figure by a wide margin, potentially climbing into the range of $1 trillion or more once every system is actually built and tested. A one-way colonization mission, stripped of the return infrastructure entirely, could realistically be accomplished for a fraction of that cost, potentially in the tens of billions rather than the hundreds of billions, which suddenly puts it within the plausible reach of a single determined nation or a coalition of private companies working together, rather than requiring the sustained, decades-long political will of an entire global superpower. So when you step back and look at the whole picture honestly, the uncomfortable truth is that the first humans on Mars won't be staying because their mission failed. And they won't be staying because they got stranded by some unlucky accident. They'll be staying because staying was always, from the very first line item on the very first budget spreadsheet, the actual plan. Coming home was never really on the table in any version of this that makes financial or physiological sense. And once you understand the real biology and the real economics side by side, that starts to feel less like tragedy and more like the only version of this mission that was ever going to work. Before anyone ever gets anywhere near a launch pad, though, they go through a selection and training process almost nobody outside the space industry has any real sense of the scale of. Agencies and private programs alike screen applicants not just for technical competence, though that bar is already extraordinarily high, requiring backgrounds in engineering, medicine, geology, or piloting deep enough to function as a genuine working specialist once boots hit Martian soil. But for something much harder to measure on paper, the ability to stay calm, cooperative, and clear headed after months of confinement with the exact same handful of people, with no walk around the block, no phone call to a friend outside the program, no door to close and be briefly, genuinely alone behind. Training for a mission of this scale realistically stretches across 5 to 10 years, depending on a candidate's starting background, and it covers an almost absurdly broad range of skills, because a Mars crew doesn't get the luxury of narrow specialization the way a hospital surgeon or a structural engineer does back on Earth. Every single colonist needs at least a working, hands-on competence in basic medical procedures, from setting a broken bone to assisting in an improvised surgical procedure. Every colonist needs enough engineering literacy to diagnose and repair or jury-rig a fix for nearly any system in the habitat, because there is no calling in a specialist contractor when the nearest hardware store is tens of millions of kilometers away. Agricultural training, geological field skills, piloting rovers and drones, construction techniques using local Martian materials, all of it has to be crammed into the same small group of people, because mass constraints on the spacecraft simply don't allow for a crew large enough to specialize the way an equivalent-sized team on Earth would. Much of that training happens in what are called Mars analog environments, remote locations on Earth deliberately chosen because some specific aspect of their conditions echoes what a Mars habitat will actually feel like. The Mars Desert Research Station in the Utah Desert, the Flashline Mars Arctic Research Station in the Canadian Arctic, remote volcanic terrain in Iceland, high-altitude deserts in Chile. Candidates spend weeks or months at a time in these locations, living inside simulated habitats, going outside only in simulated pressure suits, eating the same kind of vacuum-sealed, rehydrated food they'll eat on the actual mission, working through simulated equipment failures deliberately introduced by mission planners to test how the group handles stress and uncertainty together. No location on Earth can fully replicate the combination of Mars's thin atmosphere, its lower gravity, and its radiation environment all at once. But these analog missions remain the closest approximation available, and they become an essential filter for weeding out candidates who look perfect on a resume but genuinely struggle once the isolation stops being theoretical. Much of that training happens in what are called Mars analog environments, remote locations on Earth deliberately chosen because some specific aspect of their conditions echoes what a Mars habitat will actually feel like. The Mars Desert Research Station in the Utah Desert, the Flashline Mars Arctic Research Station in the Canadian Arctic, remote volcanic terrain in Iceland, high-altitude deserts in Chile. Candidates spend weeks or months at a time in these locations, living inside simulated habitats, going outside only in simulated pressure suits, eating the same kind of vacuum-sealed, rehydrated food they'll eat on the actual mission, working through simulated equipment failures deliberately introduced by mission planners to test how the group handles stress and uncertainty together. No location on Earth can fully replicate the combination of Mars's thin atmosphere, its lower gravity, and its radiation environment all at once. But these analog missions remain the closest approximation available, and they've become an essential filter for weeding out candidates who look perfect on a resume, but genuinely struggle once the isolation stops being theoretical. Let's talk now about where exactly these colonists would even try to live. Because the choice of location is not some minor detail, it's arguably the single most important engineering decision the entire mission hinges on, and it involves trade offs that sound almost cruelly ironic once you understand them. At the moment, there is no single agreed upon best site. The Martian North Pole is a genuine contender, largely because of the substantial water ice locked up in its polar cap. Water being the single most valuable resource on the entire planet, needed for drinking, for growing food, for manufacturing breathable oxygen through electrolysis, and eventually for producing rocket fuel. But the poles come with a brutal trade off: less sunlight for a large portion of the Martian year, which cripples solar power generation exactly when a fragile new colony needs energy the most. An alternative option researchers keep circling back to is the Korolev crater, roughly 81 kilometers wide, permanently filled with a thick layer of water ice that never fully sublimates away, even during the warmest parts of the Martian year, effectively acting like a natural, pre stocked water reservoir sitting right there, waiting to be tapped. Then there's the possibility of settling closer to the equator, near underground permafrost water deposits that orbital scans have detected scattered across the planet, trading easier access to sunlight and warmer temperatures for the added engineering difficulty of extracting water from beneath a layer of rock and regolith, instead of simply melting exposed surface ice. And then there are the lava tubes, which honestly might be the single most fascinating option of all once you understand what they actually are. Long before Mars cooled into the dead world, we see today rivers of molten lava carved out enormous underground tunnels as they flowed across the surface, tunnels that emptied out and hardened once the eruption stopped, leaving behind vast hollow caverns beneath the Martian crust. Some of them detected via orbital imaging and estimated to be large enough to comfortably house entire buildings inside. Because those tunnels sit beneath meters of solid rock, they offer something almost nothing on the exposed Martian surface can: genuine, substantial, built in protection from the relentless cosmic radiation that would otherwise be slowly cooking any colonist unlucky enough to spend too much time outside. Whichever site ultimately gets chosen, the plan every serious mission architect keeps converging on is the same in broad strokes. Robotic missions arrive first, years ahead of any human crew, using autonomous 3D printing robots that don't exist yet in any deployable form but are actively being developed. To excavate Martian regolith, mix it with water ice into something resembling concrete, and print the walls of a habitat layer by layer, entirely without human hands ever touching the site. Because performing that kind of prolonged, heavy manual labor in a pressurized suit on Mars would be effectively impossible for a human crew to do safely or efficiently. Once the printed structure exists, the final and arguably most important step is simply piling more loose regolith directly on top of it, shoveled on by robotic excavators, because Mars has no meaningful magnetic field of its own to deflect radiation, and the single most effective, low-tech shield available anywhere on the planet is simply mass. The more material sitting between the colonists and the open sky, the safer they are. Before that construction robot ever exists in deployable form, though, a different kind of machine has already been quietly proving out the underlying technology, and it's a genuinely fascinating case study in exactly what kind of robot Mars actually needs. Every wheeled rover sent to Mars so far, from Spirit and Opportunity through Curiosity and Perseverance, has shared a fundamentally similar design: six wheels, a large body, built for driving across relatively open, relatively flat terrain. But wheels come with a hard ceiling on where they can actually go. Spirit's mission effectively ended in 2009 when it became permanently trapped in a patch of unexpectedly soft sand, unable to free itself no matter what combination of wheel movements engineers tried remotely from Earth, eventually draining its own batteries in the failed attempt to escape. A four-legged walking robot, developed for industrial use on Earth under the name Spot, moves in a fundamentally different way. capable of climbing over loose gravel, navigating narrow, uneven passages a wheeled rover could never fit through, and even self-righting after a fall, using onboard artificial intelligence to build a real-time three-dimensional map of its surroundings and decide entirely on its own exactly how to navigate whatever obstacle happens to be directly in front of it. Because the communication delay between Earth and Mars makes real-time joystick control genuinely impossible, this kind of autonomous, self-directed decision-making isn't a nice bonus feature. It's an absolute engineering requirement for exploring the specific kind of terrain space agencies are most eager to reach next. Martian caves, and the ancient lava tubes hidden beneath the surface, places rich with the exact kind of geological and potentially even biological history that a flat, wheel-friendly plane simply doesn't offer. Mars has also already proven that flight itself is possible in that impossibly thin atmosphere, thanks to a small, lightweight helicopter named Ingenuity that hitched a ride to the surface strapped to the underside of the Perseverance rover. Engineers were genuinely uncertain, going in whether powered flight was even achievable in an atmosphere with roughly 1% the density of Earth's, since a helicopter blade needs far more surface area and far higher rotor speed to generate any meaningful lift in air that thin. Ingenuity was originally designed for a handful of short demonstration flights. It ended up completing over 70, traveling a combined distance of more than 17 kilometers before its mission finally ended, proving in the process that aerial scouting, something that could one day help human colonists survey terrain, locate resources, and map hazards far faster than any ground-based rover ever could, is a genuinely viable tool for the surface of another planet. Once the colonists themselves finally arrive, the honest reality is that a huge amount of their early time isn't spent doing the glamorous science fiction work of exploring alien landscapes. It's spent on the deeply unglamorous, absolutely essential labor of connecting power systems, testing life support, growing the first fragile crops in pressurized greenhouses, and slowly, methodically transforming a robotically pre-assembled shell into something that can actually keep a group of human beings alive year after year without a single supply run from Earth, arriving faster than roughly 6 to 9 months after it's requested. Growing food turns out to be one of the more genuinely encouraging parts of this whole picture, which might surprise you given everything else we've covered. In 2016, researchers actually grew a range of real crops, including tomatoes, rye, radishes, peas, spinach, and even quinoa, in soil designed to closely simulate the actual chemical composition of Martian regolith. And the results were, frankly, better than a lot of people expected. Those crops produced only slightly less yield than the exact same seeds grown in ordinary Earth soil, provided the Martian simulant was supplemented with organic matter. In that particular experiment, simply chopped up grass to loosen the soil structure and let water actually pass through to the root systems the way healthy soil requires. There is a catch, and it's a genuinely important one for anyone who has ever wondered why the film adaptation of The Martian made such a specific point of it. Martian soil contains meaningful concentrations of something called calcium perchlorate, a toxic salt that, left untreated, would be absorbed directly into any crops grown in it and, from there, into the humans who eventually ate those crops. The good news is that the fix is almost disappointingly simple. Running water through the soil effectively rinses the perchlorates out, after which the water and the perchlorates can be separated, and the perchlorates either safely stored or, more interestingly, fed to certain perchlorate-consuming bacteria that actually release oxygen as a metabolic byproduct, turning what starts out as a poison into, indirectly, a small but genuinely useful source of breathable air. Now let's talk honestly about the dust. Because if there is one force of nature on Mars capable of single-handedly ending a mission that everything else went right on, it's this one. And it doesn't care how well-funded you are or how many redundant systems you've built. Mars experiences regional dust storms with reasonable regularity, but roughly every 3 Martian years, which works out to somewhere around 5.5 Earth years, something far more extreme happens. A storm that starts regional and simply doesn't stop growing, eventually swallowing the entire visible surface of the planet at once, blotting out sunlight so completely that scientists measuring atmospheric opacity have recorded readings representing a near total blockage of light reaching the ground. For a colony that has, at least in its early years, no realistic alternative to solar power beyond experimental and politically fraught nuclear reactors, a storm like that isn't a mere inconvenience. It's an existential threat, capable of starving a settlement's power grid for weeks or even months at a stretch. This is not a hypothetical worry dreamed up by cautious engineers. It has already ended a robotic mission, and the way it happened is worth understanding in detail. In June of 2018, a dust storm formed on Mars and within days spread to cover the entire planet at once, one of the most severe storms ever recorded there. NASA's Opportunity rover, which had already been operating for nearly 15 years on a mission originally designed to last just 90 days, watched its power generation collapse from over 400 watts down to under 150 within roughly a week, as dust choked out nearly all sunlight, reaching its solar panels. Mission controllers tracked its status through a series of increasingly sparse status updates before the rover finally stopped responding altogether and entered what engineers call a low power fault. Essentially, a survival hibernation mode that shuts down every system except the bare minimum needed to protect the electronics. Teams on Earth spent months attempting to re-establish contact, sending well over 1,000 recovery commands across the following winter, before finally reluctantly declaring the mission over in February of 2019. Engineers have noted that the rover's very last confirmed transmission, before the storm swallowed it completely, translated into something close to a report that its battery level was critically low and ambient light was fading fast. A detail that has understandably struck a chord with a lot of people who followed that mission for years. If that lands for you too, you're genuinely not the only one. Now scale that same threat up from a solar-powered rover to an entire human colony that depends on continuous power, not just for scientific instruments, but for heating, for oxygen generation, for water recycling, for literally every single system standing between the colonists and death by asphyxiation or freezing. Solar-only settlements simply cannot survive a planet-wide storm without a backup power source robust enough to carry the entire habitat through weeks, sometimes months, of near total darkness, which is precisely why so many serious mission architects keep circling back, however reluctantly, to nuclear power as the only realistic long-term answer, despite the genuine political and safety complications that come with launching radioactive material off the surface of Earth in the first place. And even when the storms aren't at their full planet-devouring scale, the everyday dust on Mars is its own quiet menace. It's electrostatic, meaning it clings stubbornly to surfaces the way packing peanuts cling to your hands. And it's abrasive enough that engineers have specifically avoided putting mechanical wipers on rover solar panels, because testing showed the wiping motion would grind the fine, sharp particles directly into the panel surface, causing more damage than the dust buildup it was meant to remove. The only thing that has reliably cleaned dust off solar panels on Mars, across multiple missions, has been sheer luck. The wind occasionally kicking up a passing dust devil that happens to sweep directly over the equipment and blow the accumulated grime away. A phenomenon engineers can't predict, can't control, and can only hope shows up before it's too late. Given everything we've walked through so far, this raises a genuinely fair question that plenty of serious credentialed scientists ask without a hint of hesitation. Is sending humans to Mars actually the smartest use of the money and the risk involved? Or would robotic missions, sent by the dozens instead of by the single crewed handful, actually teach us more, for a fraction of the cost, without ever putting a single human life on the line? A rover doesn't need food, water, or breathable air. It doesn't need to come home. It doesn't experience fear, or loneliness, or the slow, grinding psychological toll of watching Earth shrink into a point of light out a tiny window. If a rover breaks down, or gets stuck in soft sand, or loses power during a dust storm, that's a profound scientific loss, but it isn't a tragedy in the way a lost human life is a tragedy. For the same total budget required to send even one crewed mission to Mars and support it for the multi-year duration of the trip, you could plausibly fund 10, 20, potentially even more robotic missions, spread across dramatically more locations on the planet, gathering an enormous volume of comparable scientific data without a single person ever being placed at risk. But there's a counter-argument that keeps surfacing, again and again, from people who have spent their entire careers working directly with these robotic missions, and it's worth taking seriously rather than dismissing. A human geologist standing at a rock formation can notice something genuinely interesting, make an instant judgment call, and adjust their entire sampling strategy on the spot, in real time, based on what their trained eyes and their accumulated field experience are telling them. A rover, by comparison, has to send images back to Earth, wait for scientists to review them, wait for new instructions to be formulated, and sent back across a communication delay that can stretch past 20 minutes each way, and only then execute a decision that a human standing right there could have made and acted on in seconds. Consider the actual timeline of Opportunity's real mission. It took Opportunity more than 11 years to travel a total distance of roughly 42 kilometers. A distance a reasonably fit human being could comfortably walk in something like a single week. There is genuinely no substitute yet built by any space agency on Earth for the raw adaptability, the creative problem solving under pressure, and the sheer physical dexterity of an actual human being standing on the actual ground, in the actual moment, making decisions no algorithm has been trained to make. Now, assuming everything goes right, assuming the fuel is manufactured successfully, assuming the habitats hold, assuming the first crop cycles come in strong, and assuming the colony genuinely begins to grow beyond that first small handful of pioneers, an entirely new set of questions starts to emerge. And these are questions no engineer, no matter how brilliant, can solve with better hardware. Who actually governs a colony that sits at its very closest approach, still tens of millions of kilometers from Earth, separated by a communication delay stretching anywhere from a few minutes up to more than 20? If mission control back on Earth issues an order the colonists on the ground genuinely believe is unsafe or unreasonable, what actually happens? Do they comply purely out of institutional obligation to whichever government or company funded their journey in the first place? Or do they act on their own judgment, fully aware that by the time Earth even receives their response explaining why they didn't comply, the situation on the ground will have already moved on entirely? History offers a pretty consistent answer to what tends to happen here, even if it takes decades or centuries to fully play out. The American colonies eventually declared independence from Britain. Australia's path ran from penal colony to fully independent nation. Even Antarctica, governed today by an unusually cooperative international treaty, still sees regular, ongoing disputes over sovereignty and resource rights among the nations operating research stations there. Mars, if it ever grows large enough to become genuinely self-sufficient, producing its own food, manufacturing its own tools and spare parts, no longer dependent on resupply missions from Earth just to survive month to month, would very plausibly follow a similar trajectory, except potentially compressed into a much shorter timeline. Because the sheer physical distance and the built-in communication delay make any kind of meaningful, timely enforcement from Earth genuinely, structurally difficult in a way no Earthbound colonial power has ever had to grapple with before. Let's talk now about something that gets treated as a footnote in most discussions of Mars colonization, when it honestly deserves to be treated as one of the single most serious life or death questions in the entire mission plan. What actually happens when someone gets sick or injured in a way that would be routine, unremarkable, even boring back on Earth. Appendicitis, a broken bone from a fall during a routine excavation task, a severe allergic reaction to something in the greenhouse. On Earth, these are Tuesday afternoon emergency room visits, treated by the trained specialists using equipment developed and refined over more than a century of modern medicine. On Mars, in the earliest years of any settlement, there is no hospital, there is no surgical suite, there is no blood bank. There is, at best, one or two crew members with cross-training in basic emergency medicine, equipped with whatever surgical tools and medical supplies could be fit into the mission's tightly constrained mass budget. Telemedicine offers a partial answer, and a genuinely useful one during routine situations, letting the on-site medic consult in near real time with actual specialist physicians back on Earth. But remember, that communication delay we've already talked through in detail, stretching anywhere from roughly 3 minutes at closest approach, up past 20 minutes when Mars sits farther away in its orbit. In a genuine surgical emergency, where seconds and minutes can be the difference between a patient stabilizing or crashing, a doctor on Earth simply cannot walk someone through a procedure in real time the way you'd expect from a phone call. Every single instruction has to be sent, and then the sender has to simply wait. Sometimes for the better part of an hour, for a full round-trip exchange, while the situation on the ground continues evolving in ways Earth won't even know about until it's already happened. In practice, this means the on-site medic has to be prepared to make consequential, potentially life or death decisions essentially alone, guided only by pre-recorded training material, written protocols prepared months or years in advance, and their own judgment in the moment, fully aware that the nearest actual hospital, in any meaningful sense of the word, is, at absolute best, many months away. This single fact, more than almost any other detail we've covered in this entire video, is why crew selection for a genuine long-duration Mars mission places such extraordinary weight on psychological resilience and emotional stability. In addition to raw technical skill, a brilliant engineer who crumbles under pressure during a crisis, or who lets a personal grudge against a crewmate fester into open conflict, isn't just a productivity problem the way it might be in an office back on Earth. In an environment this unforgiving, that kind of breakdown in composure or cooperation can genuinely, directly threaten the survival of the entire crew, which loops directly back to why so much of that multi-year training process we talked about earlier focuses as heavily on conflict resolution and emotional regulation as it does on hard technical expertise. And that raises a genuinely uncomfortable question worth sitting with, honestly, rather than glossing over. If romantic relationships inevitably form within a small, isolated mixed crew living together for years, which virtually every serious behavioral researcher who studies isolated environments agrees is essentially unavoidable given enough time and proximity, how does a mission plan for the very real possibility of a breakup unfolding inside a habitat with nowhere for either person to go, no separate space to retreat to, no option to simply stop seeing each other for a while? Some mission architects have proposed the far more conservative approach of only ever sending established, already committed couples. People who've already weathered years of a relationship together back on Earth, specifically to avoid this exact scenario playing out for the first time under the added compounding pressure of permanent isolation on another planet. We should talk honestly too about pregnancy and childbirth, because it's a subject that tends to get quietly skipped over in most popular discussions of Mars colonization, and it genuinely shouldn't be, given how central it is to whether any of this is even sustainable in the long run. For the first wave of colonists, virtually every serious mission planner treats an unplanned pregnancy as a genuine, potentially catastrophic complication, rather than a milestone worth celebrating. And it's important to actually understand why, rather than just accepting that as a given. There are no obstetricians standing by, no neonatal intensive care unit, no real understanding yet, based on any actual clinical data, of how a developing fetus would respond to the combination of reduced gravity and significantly elevated radiation exposure, both of which we already know cause serious, well documented harm to adult bodies that have already finished growing. Complications during labor that would be swiftly and safely managed inside any well equipped hospital delivery room back on Earth could become genuinely life threatening for both mother and child in a habitat built primarily for research and basic survival rather than advanced maternal medicine. Later missions, once a colony has grown large enough and stable enough and medically equipped enough to properly support families, would presumably shift that calculus considerably. And that shift matters enormously because it leads directly into what might be the single most staggering, quietly emotional implication buried anywhere in this entire subject, one that deserves far more attention than it typically gets. A child conceived and born on Mars, growing up under only 38% of Earth's gravity from their very first breath, would develop an entirely different body from the one you and I take for granted every single day without a second thought. Their bones would very likely grow thinner and less dense, calibrated by their own developing skeleton to the much weaker gravitational load they've experienced their entire lives. Because unlike an adult astronaut whose body developed under full Earth gravity and then experiences loss in space, a Martian born child's body would be building itself from scratch under Martian conditions from the very beginning. Their muscles would likely develop with a different baseline strength profile entirely. Some researchers who study this have gone as far as suggesting these children might end up taller than an Earth-born person of the same genetic background, simply because their spines and long bones wouldn't be constantly compressed by 3 times the gravitational load a body raised on Earth experiences every waking moment. And here's the part that I think is genuinely the most staggering implication of all. A child born and raised entirely on Mars might grow up to be biologically and structurally incapable of ever safely visiting the planet their own parents came from. Earth's full gravity, 3 times what their body developed under, could place a genuinely dangerous strain on a skeleton and cardiovascular system that never had to bear that kind of load, potentially even preventing that child from ever standing upright comfortably or walking without significant pain and risk on the very world where human life itself first began. Think about what that actually means, layered on top of everything we already know about the parents. The first generation of colonists leaves Earth understanding, from the very beginning, that they are almost certainly never coming home. And then, if the colony survives long enough to have children, those children could be born into a body that makes returning to Earth not simply a matter of choice, or expense, or logistics, but something closer to a physical impossibility built directly into their bones before they ever took a single breath. 2 separate branches of the same species, sharing identical origins, permanently and physically divided from one another, not by law, not by politics, not even really by distance in the end, but by the simple, unforgiving pull of gravity itself. Let's talk honestly about money, because a colony that can't eventually pay for its own continued existence, in some form or another, is a colony that's ultimately at the mercy of whichever government's budget priority happened to be fashionable back on Earth in any given decade. And history has shown us, over and over, just how fragile that kind of dependency can be. Mars is not, despite what some of the more breathless coverage of asteroid mining and planetary resources likes to suggest, sitting on some untapped treasure chest that will obviously make someone enormously rich the moment the first mining operation gets running. It does have resources genuinely worth talking about. Enormous quantities of water ice, locked into the polar caps and scattered through subsurface permafrost across a huge portion of the planet, which matters less as an export commodity and more as the literal foundation everything else depends on, since water underpins drinking supplies, oxygen production through electrolysis, hydroponic agriculture, and eventually rocket fuel manufacturing all at once. Mars also holds meaningful deposits of iron oxide, the very compound responsible for its distinctive rust red color in the first place, along with a range of other minerals, and even trace amounts of deuterium, a heavy hydrogen isotope that could theoretically become valuable if humanity ever manages to make fusion power a genuinely practical, widely deployed energy source, something that has remained tantalizingly just out of reach for the better part of a century of active research. The honest, unglamorous truth, though, is that physically shipping raw materials back to Earth across tens of millions of kilometers is almost certainly never going to make economic sense. Not when the same raw materials, in many cases, are available far more cheaply and far more accessibly from asteroids or from the Moon, both of which sit dramatically closer to Earth and, in the Moon's case, in a much shallower gravity well that's considerably easier and cheaper to launch cargo out of. Whatever genuine economic value Mars ultimately offers to Earth is far more likely to be strategic than it is to be a straightforward resource extraction story. A second fully independent location for human civilization to exist. A forward staging base positioned significantly closer than Earth to the asteroid belt and to the outer solar system, useful for future missions that would otherwise have to launch that extra distance directly from the bottom of Earth's much deeper gravity well. A genuinely unique research platform for studying planetary formation, for studying astrobiology, and for studying in direct, first-hand, unavoidable detail exactly what happens to the human body over the very long term under conditions no laboratory back on Earth can ever fully replicate. None of that generates the kind of straightforward, easily explainable profit margin that tends to attract sustained private investment on its own, which is exactly why the most realistic funding model for the first several decades of any Mars colony almost certainly involves some blended combination of government space agencies, private companies pursuing a mix of genuine long term strategic vision and PR value, and gradually increasing internal self sufficiency as the colony itself slowly reduces its own dependency on constant resupply from Earth. Every single cargo mission that successfully arrives, carrying things like 3D printers capable of fabricating tools and spare parts directly out of local materials, industrial equipment for refining raw Martian ore into usable pure metals, or genetic seed libraries preserving crop diversity for future agricultural resilience, incrementally increases the colony's independence and correspondingly decreases just how catastrophic any single supply disruption from Earth would ultimately be. Most serious mission architects who've actually run the numbers on this land somewhere in the range of 1 to 2 centuries, not years, not decades, before a colony could plausibly grow from that first handful of pioneers into something on the order of tens of thousands of permanent inhabitants, complete with actual specialized professions, genuine local governance structures, universities dedicated specifically to Martian focused research, and enough industrial capacity to be considered meaningfully self sufficient, rather than perpetually, precariously dependent on the next scheduled cargo launch from Earth arriving on time. Terraforming, the far more ambitious, far more speculative idea of transforming Mars's entire atmosphere and surface conditions into something resembling Earth's, thickening the atmosphere enough to support liquid water on the surface and eventually breathable air, sits on a timescale that stretches the discussion from mere centuries into genuine millennia, and it comes with a problem that a huge amount of casual online discourse about Mars colonization tends to conveniently skip over entirely, even if humanity found some genuinely workable, large-scale method of thickening Mars's atmosphere, whether through some combination of engineered greenhouse gases, redirected asteroid impacts, or technology nobody has even seriously theorized yet. Mars still lacks the one thing that made Earth's atmosphere stable and durable enough to support life continuously for billions of years in the first place. A strong, planet-generated magnetic field produced by a still molten, actively convecting metallic core. Without that magnetic shielding, solar wind would simply continue stripping away any newly thickened atmosphere over time. The exact same slow, relentless process that scientists believe is responsible for stripping Mars of its original, genuinely much thicker atmosphere billions of years ago in the first place, back when the planet is believed to have had rivers, lakes, and quite possibly a genuine ocean covering a meaningful portion of its northern lowlands. Any realistic terraforming effort wouldn't just need to build an atmosphere once. It would likely need some ongoing, permanent method of continuously replenishing it indefinitely forever, which is an engineering problem several full orders of magnitude harder than the initial atmosphere thickening step itself, and one nobody currently has anything close to a workable answer for. So here's the actual unromantic reality that so much of the popular imagination around Mars quietly skips past. For at least the first several generations, and quite plausibly for far longer than that, the vast majority of human life on Mars is always going to happen underground, or beneath domes, or inside pressurized structures buried under meters of shoveled regolith, never in open air, never under an unfiltered Martian sky. The stunning, wide open, terraformed vision of Mars that so many concept artists love to paint, humans walking freely across green, breathable landscapes under a pink sky, isn't remotely close on any realistic engineering timeline. It's something that, if it ever happens at all, belongs to descendants so many generations removed from the first colonists that the connection between them would feel less like family history and more like genuine, distant mythology. And that's exactly why humans are so drawn to searching Mars in the first place, beyond simple curiosity about the planet next door. Billions of years ago, before its magnetic field faded and its atmosphere bled away into space, Mars is believed to have looked genuinely different, with rivers carving visible channels across its surface, with lakes, and quite possibly a shallow ocean covering a meaningful portion of its northern hemisphere, conditions that, at least in theory, could have been suitable for life to take hold. If microbial life ever did emerge on ancient Mars, traces of it could still be preserved today, locked in sedimentary rock, frozen in subsurface ice, perhaps even lingering in dormant form somewhere deep underground where liquid water might still occasionally exist. Finding definitive evidence either way that life arose independently on a second world in our own solar system, or that Earth genuinely is uniquely alone in that regard, even on our own cosmic doorstep, would be one of the most significant scientific discoveries in the entire history of our species. And it's a question no robotic rover, however capable, has yet been able to fully answer on its own. And that leads naturally into something that I think is one of the single most fascinating and most consistently underexplored threads in this entire conversation. What actually happens to human culture itself once a meaningfully sized population has spent multiple generations living permanently isolated on another planet, cut off from Earth by that same brutal communication delay we've talked about throughout this entire video? Language doesn't stay perfectly static anywhere it's spoken, not even here on Earth, where dialects and slang and entirely new grammatical patterns drift and evolve continuously across regions separated by nothing more than a few hundred kilometers and a shared border. Now imagine an entire population separated from Earth, not by a border but by tens of millions of kilometers, and a communication lag that makes truly fluid, real time cultural exchange functionally impossible, developing its own specific vocabulary for concepts and experiences that simply have no direct Earth equivalent at all. Words for the exact particular quality of Martian dust storm light. Words for the specific psychological experience of watching Earth from the Martian surface shrink down to something barely brighter than a distant star in the night sky. An entire generation of children who have never once, in their entire lives, seen an ocean, a forest, rain, or an open, unfiltered sky, for whom all of those concepts exist only as second-hand stories and video footage passed down from parents and grandparents who made the crossing the same way a fourth-generation immigrant on Earth might hold on to stories of a homeland they've genuinely never personally set foot in. Art, in the same way, would almost certainly evolve to reflect an environment that Earth based artistic traditions were never actually built to describe in the first place. Painters working to accurately capture the specific, particular shade of pink the Martian sky turns at sunset, a color inversion of Earth's sunsets caused by fine dust scattering light in an entirely different way than Earth's much thicker, much cleaner atmosphere does. Musicians experimenting with instruments deliberately modified to function properly and to sound right in an atmosphere with roughly 1% of Earth's air pressure, where sound itself simply travels differently, carrying less energy and behaving in ways an Earth and trained musician's instincts wouldn't naturally anticipate. Literature and storytelling almost inevitably circling back, over and over generation after generation, to the same central, unresolved themes of permanent separation, of profound sacrifice, and of the strange, layered experience of building an entirely new home while still carrying the inherited memory of an old one you yourself never actually lived in. Let's talk about the actual reasons serious people give for pursuing any of this in the first place, despite every single risk we've just spent this much time walking through in detail, because it ties every single thread we've covered so far into one unavoidable, sobering conclusion. 66 million years ago, an asteroid roughly 10 kilometers across slammed into what is now the Yucatan Peninsula, with force equivalent to billions of nuclear weapons detonating simultaneously, throwing so much dust and debris into Earth's atmosphere that sunlight was blocked for months, collapsing plant life, collapsing the food chains that depended on it, and ultimately wiping out somewhere around 75% of all species alive on the planet at that moment, including every non-avian dinosaur that had dominated Earth's ecosystems for roughly 160 million years up to that point. That event wasn't even the worst mass extinction Earth has endured. The Permian-Triassic extinction, roughly 252 million years ago, is estimated to have killed off something like 96% of all marine species and around 70% of land vertebrates, an event so catastrophic that Earth's entire biosphere came terrifyingly close to being effectively sterilized before slowly, over tens of millions of years, clawing its way back. Modern human civilization, everything you have ever known, every book, every piece of music, every language, every memory anyone has ever had, exists entirely within a window of roughly 10,000 years on a planet that is 4.5 billion years old, sitting directly in the path of a solar system that has already proven, repeatedly, through the geologic record, that it is capable of hurling planet-altering catastrophes our way, with no warning whatsoever. That's not fear-mongering, that's simply what the fossil record shows us, over and over again, whether we're comfortable looking directly at it or not. If human civilization exists on only one planet, then any single sufficiently catastrophic event, whether that's an asteroid we don't spot in time, a supervolcano eruption on a scale we've genuinely never witnessed in recorded history, or some other disaster we haven't even properly imagined yet, has the potential to end everything, permanently, all at once, with no second attempt possible anywhere in the universe. A functioning, self-sustaining human presence on Mars, however difficult, however biologically brutal, however financially staggering to establish, functions as something close to an insurance policy for the entire species, a genuine backup copy of human civilization and human knowledge stored somewhere a single planetary catastrophe couldn't simultaneously reach and erase both at once. That is the actual argument. Not glory, not planting a flag for the cameras, not national pride dressed up in a launch broadcast. Survival, on a timescale most of us never think about because it's genuinely uncomfortable to sit with for very long, spanning not just our own lifetimes, or our children's lifetimes, but potentially the entire remaining future of everything our species has ever built, or ever will build. Let's close this out with something that circles back to the very first footprint pressed into that dust, because there's a genuinely strange physical detail about it that most people never stop to think about. Mars has no flowing water on its surface today, no wind strong enough to meaningfully erode deep ground impressions the way Earth's weather does, and no vegetation that could ever grow up and over a footprint the way it would here, within a matter of months. Whatever mark the first human boot leaves in that fine, rust-colored dust is not a symbolic gesture destined to fade the way a name written in beach sand disappears with the next tide. Scientists studying Martian surface erosion rates have suggested that an undisturbed footprint pressed into that dust could plausibly persist, essentially unchanged, for hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of years, quietly outlasting every government, every company, every single person who ever argued about whether this mission was worth funding in the first place. Think about what that actually means for a second, because I don't think it fully lands the first time you hear it. Long after every one of us watching this video is gone, long after the specific names of the first colonists have faded from casual public memory, the way the individual passengers of the Mayflower or the members of Shackleton's crew have largely faded for Most people today, that single physical impression in the Martian dust will very plausibly still be sitting there, exactly as it was left, waiting, in a way nothing on Earth's constantly shifting, constantly eroding surface ever truly gets to wait. And that, more than any statistic about bone density or radiation exposure we've covered in this entire video, might be the single detail that actually explains why people keep signing up for this in the first place, despite understanding every single risk in exhaustive clinical detail. Not the fantasy of coming home a hero, not the reality show Spectacle Mars One once tried to build around the idea. Something closer to the oldest, most fundamentally human impulse there is, the simple, powerful desire to leave a permanent mark on something bigger than any single lifetime could ever be, and to know with genuine certainty that this particular mark, unlike almost anything else any of us will ever do, truly will last. So here's the actual honest question I want to leave you with, and I genuinely mean this. Not as a throwaway line to pad out a video, but as something worth actually sitting with for a minute after you finish watching. If you knew every single fact we just walked through, the bones, the heart, the radiation, the total permanent isolation, and you were offered the exact same choice those 200,000 applicants were offered, a one-way ticket to another world, no return trip, no changing your mind halfway there, what would you actually do? Not the answer that sounds impressive, the real one. Tell me in the comments, and tell me exactly why, because I read every single one, and I promise you, the range of honest answers to that question says something genuinely fascinating about what it actually means to be human in the first place.